So we're going to look at the message of the Apostle John's second letter to the churches. And this one is called Tender Love, and I hope you'll see why. But we're going to start with, who was it written to? And the recipient was described as the elect lady and her children. And John describes himself very interestingly, not as often the Apostle Paul would have said, I'm the Apostle John, and you're going to have to do what I tell you. No, he describes himself simply as an elder, as a leader of the church. I'm one of you. And he's writing to a lady, as we can see, who is also an elder, or bishop, as they were sometimes called in those days, in charge of a church. And he describes her as chosen. That's what the word elect, chosen by God, chosen to be a believer, which each one of us who have trusted Jesus have become, but chosen also for leadership and chosen to be one who would give an example to others. And John describes with this careful and loving touch of saying, whom I love in the truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth. In other words, this lady was not just a leader, but highly respected through all the churches of that part of the world. And I'll show you a little picture of that. It's not given what her name is, but the word used about her is Kyria. For those of you who know anything about Greek or Latin, the word Kyrios means Lord. And most of the time in the Bible, when the word Kyrios is used, it refers to the Lord God or to Jesus Christ. She has got the feminine name of that, which means she was highly respected in the community. And of course, in Britain today, if you are a lady or a lord, you have a seat in the House of Lords, and you decide the great matters of state of the nation. I'm not suggesting that she was in that position, but she was highly honored and respected. And it says that her children walk in the truth, that her children were believers as well, and that the greeting that John brings is from the children of her sister. It was from her nephews and nieces who were in John's church writing this message. It was a real person, a real lady, and it says that she was one who had a church in her house, and that I'll explain in a second. Some people think that this was a letter that wasn't written to it, because their view is, well, you couldn't possibly have such an important lady in charge of a church. Well, I'm sorry for the male misogynists who are still around in the church today that hold to those prejudiced views. But it's quite clear this individual was highly respected and honored, and it gives us a glimpse to the church. It didn't matter male or female, as Paul made clear. It was the gifting of God and the love and grace of God in a person's heart that stood them out as a candidate for leadership, which this lady most certainly was. And it gives us a further insight into the churches in John's day. Excuse me. And John was the apostle who ended up in the town of Ephesus, which is over here. He started off in Jerusalem, as we know, and then ended up in Ephesus, in that city, which was the chief city for all these churches in what's called the province of Asia. And those churches, many of them are mentioned by name in the book of Revelation, as some of you know, and were the key churches that grew the gospel in the first century. And they were all house churches. In other words, you didn't have a big basilica or even a nice building like this. You didn't have a chapel on a hill. No, Christians didn't gather in places like that regularly. Sometimes they would come into a library or a big place where they had opportunity. But the church at that day was based in the home. And the idea of getting house groups and growing together as families and building out from that family into the community is so important for that day, and also for this lady and the church that she was in charge of. And as we go forward, we see that the same themes have come out: truth and love. You can't have truth unless you've got love. Truth without love is just legalism. Truth with love is the Spirit of God. And love without truth is just emotion. Truth is the basis for it. And that is where this church was going. Indeed, one of those churches in the book of Revelation was written to, and John wrote these words, "You have lost your first love." And yet that church was commended for their discipline and theology in keeping out evil teachers. You see, it's possible to be a believer, but to lose your first love, to get carried away too much with the teaching, or carried away too much with formality, or the way we organize churches and buildings and people and places, and we get too self-important. You cannot have one without the other. If you're going to walk in truth, you walk in love. And that is the growth that we see in the church today. Then the letter moves on to give her a warning. And this is the real reason why John wrote it. Because there were out there wolves in sheep's clothing. There were people who started off in churches. They claimed they'd become a Christian, and they would stay in the church. But then gradually, they wanted to move on. There was more, they thought. They wanted to add extra bits into Christian teaching. And Jesus has come in the flesh, it says here. But what some of these people believe, we understand, is that Jesus came and he was born just a normal man. This is one of the teachings of the Gnostics. And that when he was baptized by John, God came upon him and endowed him with miracles and gifts and teaching. And then as he went to the cross, God left him again and forsook him. And this false notion of who Jesus truly was started influencing and infiltrating true teaching in the churches. And so that was something that the lady was warned, be on your guard so that you do not lose what we have worked for. And one of the readings is what you have worked for. In other words, this lady had built this church up, taught them. They were mature Christian disciples. But the warning was that these people were on the go. They were liars, deceivers, anti-Christians, teaching against Christ, not for him. And so the warning is, anyone who doesn't stick or abide in the teaching of Christ, who's trying to move beyond, I'm going to get a doctorate, I'm going to get more, I'm going to learn more that will make me better than you, who thinks they can, by learning and knowledge, gain a higher position with God, rather than by learning humbly at the feet of Jesus and through grace. And that was what she was warned against. And that those who do that, don't receive them. Don't let them into your house. Make sure they stay well away. Otherwise, you end up sharing in what they're up to. And the same message could go out for Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons who keep knocking on your door, to keep well clear. And he finishes. I love this. He says to her, hey, no more emails. Do you get it? You grow by face-to-face contact. We don't grow just, okay, yes, it's great. And those of you who are watching on TV, I know some of you are watching at home, and the luxury of your home with your coffee or whatever you're drinking beside it. It's lovely, yes. And when you can't get out, that is wonderful. But the thing is, we miss you. The point of fellowship is not just that you hear what's taught, but that you share your experience with one another and in fellowship build up. That's face-to-face. And those of you who work like I do, spending our time mainly working from home, what they're doing nowadays, incidentally, when I go on for meetings, they're insisting we all turn our home cameras on. Do you remember COVID? We used to sit in our pajamas and then turn the cameras off. But now you have to turn them on, so you've got to put your suit and tie. Well, you don't need a suit and tie, but you know what I mean. In other words, we've got to look a bit closer face to face. But the opportunity now to get back into work and have face-to-face meetings where the nuances of what you really mean, where the expression and misunderstanding can be kept to a minimum and people can question more detailed. That's what we need to do. And it is that way that the church and the Bible tells us, keep on meeting together. So that's how we spur one another towards love. We don't give up, but we encourage one another. Let's do that Sunday by Sunday, week by week, house group by house group. Let's grow together and keep in touch. Informal groups or formal. Amen. And so we come to the talk around 3rd John. And while the first letter may have been about tender love and a warning to this remarkable lady, this one is about tough love. There are 3 men named here. Gaius, who was the guy who received this letter, who was the recipient. A fellow called Diotrephes, who was up to no good. And then thirdly, a chap by the name of Demetrius, who in all likelihood was the chap who delivered the letter to Gaius. So let's see the different approach that is needed in this letter. And again, it's quite short, and I hope we can pick out the main points. And I am going to certainly make sure I bring it a little bit more up to date to help us understand some of these issues haven't gone away. So the recipient was somebody called Gaius. And the name Gaius is a very popular name. It's like Patrick in Ireland or John in England or somewhere like that. You know, it's everybody was called that. But the name means rejoice. He was a happy chappy. And John describes how he really loves him in the truth. Why does John have such an affection? Because this guy stood by the word. He taught the Bible. He lived the Bible. And this was a personality he commended to others. And then he says these words. He says that I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health, just as it is well with your soul. I have a friend in Ireland. His name is John Scott, who became an Anglican minister for many years. And John, I remember when he was in the youth fellowship, explained this to us. He said, do you know, if some people said this to the Christian church today, it wouldn't be all that good. In other words, may your health be as good as your soul is. And I think an awful lot of cripples would be out there if they looked at the souls of some of the people that we find at times, because sometimes we are in a poor state. But this guy, it was well with his soul. He was avid. He had a heart that burned for the Lord, and a few health problems clearly to go with it. And then he says, I was overjoyed when some of the friends arrived. This is an unusual term, and I've stuck with the new RSV because that's the version we've gotten about. I wish I hadn't, because that's wrong. It doesn't actually convey the meaning at all. The word in Greek is the word adelphoi, and that word is translated brothers and sisters. In other words, the word friends doesn't mean somebody who drops in for a minute, has a cup of tea and leaves. No, these were the stalwart believers of the church. And these group of friends or adelphoi or believers who were there visiting had arrived, and they were going around those churches I showed you in the map and sharing the good news about Jesus and building the house churches up in faith. And it says that this chap, Gaius, received them. And even though they were strangers, they all testified to the deep love that Gaius had for them and for the church. And it says these friends or preachers, let's call them, or teachers, began their journey for the sake of Jesus, and they didn't accept any support from non-believers. They weren't going to draw down from the local taxes or whatever. And they're described as co-workers with John and eager to promote truth. So Gaius was clearly a hospitable person, a generous person, and one who warmly received those who brought the truth and taught the truth. And he made sure they had a good night's sleep, a good breakfast in the morning, full English, no doubt, and that they were sent on their way, praising God, and made sure that they could be healthy and able to teach. And he probably threw some spare cash to get the bus fare to the next place. You get the idea, don't you? Well, Gaius is commended. However, it now goes on to talk about somebody different. And this guy was a leader in one of the churches. And his name is Diotrephes. And I've called him Diotrephes the bully. And I think you'll see in a minute why. And it's interesting what his name means. If Gaius means rejoice, that's a nice Christian name. Diotrephes means cherished by Zeus or Apollo. Who's that? Well, that's the guy in the statue. It's not Diotrephes, by the way. That's a statue of Zeus, who was the god of thunder and also the chief god of all the Greek gods. So his parents had called him, and they clearly weren't believers, they had called him Diotrephes as a child. And it meant that he felt important. Zeus cherishes me. The top god is looking after me. And when he became a believer, he didn't change his name. He still kept that idea. Even though this time he's a believer in Jesus, and he truly believed what he was preaching. But this guy, we discover, had some faults and some problems. And John indeed says, when I get there, I'm going to sort him out. So trouble was coming ahead. And so it lists some of the things he was doing. He had built up a personality cult. He put himself first. He was abusing the church as a forum that he could be seen as the leader, the boss, the guy with the collar the wrong way around and the robes or whatever he put into it. In other words, I'm the important one. He didn't realize the example of his Savior, Jesus Christ, who followed humbly. And most interestingly about this idea of the names, do you know the Apostle Paul was originally called Saul? Saul was the name of the first king of Israel, a Benjamite. And Saul was born as a Benjamite and took that name on. That is the Apostle Paul. But when Paul became a believer and went out into the mission field, he changed it from Saul, I'm the king, to Paul. Paul means humble. You get it? Many Christians deliberately changed their name to show the change that Jesus had made within. Diotrephes didn't. He developed the personality cult, and therefore he rejected the authority of the apostles, particularly John. And then he started spreading rumors, false rumors about what the other believers were up to. Not just that, with the church's own self, he refused to let the preachers come in, the friends, and teach this congregation. He wanted to stick with control, micromanage the church and keep control. And he stopped others in the congregation from welcoming them. And if they did welcome them, bang, you're out. You're not coming back to my church. And you see the dangers that exist. Now, have you spotted something in this? In writing to the lady in 2 John, John gives very stern warnings about false teaching getting into the church. Diotrephes wasn't a false teacher. He probably could teach the gospel as well as the next guy. You get me? His faults weren't in theology, but character. And this is not exclusive to the first century Christian church. By no means. And therefore, there's lessons for us today. And so John warns, do not imitate what is evil, but imitate what is good. And of course, churches today, you would say, we don't suffer from these things. Oh, no? I wonder if you heard of the Jesus Army. If you haven't, go on to BBC iPlayer and watch the video on it. To see how the corruption, and there's a Baptist church called Bugborough Church in Northamptonshire that had a lay pastor called Noel Stanton, who claimed to be, and by all accounts, was a very charismatic preacher and claimed charismatic gifts. And he took this church and built it up very rapidly, concentrating on young people and teaching them all sorts of things and getting people into ecstasy during the services. Very attractive to many young people because it was a physical feeling experience, but not a teaching experience. Nevertheless, he did preach much of the same gospel. But as things grew, the church moved out and formed a commune. And as it developed, he then produced a whole set of rules and regulations so that children were separated from their parents, husbands were separated from wives, and he could have complete control, micromanagement. And can you see where that was going to go? Yes, sexual immorality and abuse of children. And the series draws it all out. You see, It's easy to use the gospel as a cover for evil. It's easy to be a preacher of the truth and understand it, and not necessarily drift into the Gnostic teaching or false heresy, but make it a personality cult. Beware the evil one coming in this way. Now I'm going to hit the button, and I'm going to shock some of you, because the next example is more recent, and it's sadly an example that this church and Salisbury Church had contributed, not themselves towards, but had been some of those who had benefited from this ministry. And it's called Soul Survivor. And the church was founded by a chap called Mike Pilavacci, who grew up a Baptist. But when he became mature, he decided to join the Anglican Church, which had more control. The minister had more control in an Anglican church. And then he developed a program, again, of heavily charismatic ministry of Soul Survivor, taking young people away from churches into camps and into places for holiday for a week, and then basically wrapping up the atmosphere. And it only came out later and more recently just how much that atmosphere was wrapped up and had become a personality cult. Nobody is questioning that much of what he taught wasn't true. But it is the personality cult that led to it, and then led to abuse, including forms of sexual abuse. And there's a report out recently, it arrived last November, I think. If you read that report, I urge you to realize just how easy it is for churches to be pushed off the rails by personality. We're not here to worship our minister, our elders, our deacons. We're here to serve Jesus. Servant leadership is what the church calls for. And this book in here gives us a great example through the example of Gaius, but the bad example of Diotrephes. And the word that Paul said is this: let him who thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. Any one of us can drift unless day by day we humbly come in prayer before God. So that's a lesson to us as it was to them. But they weren't all bad, and the guy Demetrius who delivered this letter was commended. But this is about tough love, and action needed to be taken. But again, he reminds us, talk face to face. That's often the way we avoid the drift towards the wrong behaviors and continue to encourage other believers outside and inside. And he signs off, love and kisses, go on. That's it. Okay, I hope that was helpful. And I hope we can learn something from even these tiny little books. We gain a glimpse, but let's reflect that God is the Lord. There is only one Lord, and it's certainly not us, but we are his humble servants. Let us walk humbly